Charles Pillar, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here, Andrew.
So we're here to talk about your book called Doctored, which is a deep dive investigation into the world of Alzheimer's research and drug development. So just to set the stage, can you first talk about your background and what led you to write this book?
Sure. So I'm an investigative reporter for Science magazine, and listeners may know that it's a very important scientific journal, but there's also a journalism part of the journal that I work for, and I do almost exclusively deep dive investigative stories about scientific issues having to do with science research. So I have a long background in doing investigations for newspapers and magazines. I've worked at both over the course of my career. And this set of stories that led to my book, Doctored, began in 2021 when I became connected with a young scientist at Vanderbilt University named Matthew Schrag, who is himself a neuroscientist who has a lab where he studies Alzheimer's disease. And also he has a practice where he treats patients because he's also a physician for the symptoms of dementia. And Schrag and I became acquainted through our mutual interest in understanding better some of the problems associated with a drug called simufilum, an experimental drug from a company called Cassava Sciences. And Schrag, in addition to his talents as a doctor and scientist, had become quite adept at understanding how to examine scientific images for possible doctoring. So, in a sense, you could describe it as photoshopping certain elements of these scientific images to make them better fit the hypothesis of the experimenter, which of course is in itself very improper because it falsely portrays the results of an experiment. And that was the initial way in which I got an entry point into this question of Alzheimer's disease, and really it expanded dramatically from there.
So we will get into the misconduct that you wrote about, and it was quite jarring to read about. Let's start first with Alzheimer's. So we've made a lot of progress on other major areas of public health issues, heart disease, diabetes, for instance. Why has Alzheimer's been such a hard disease to treat effectively?
Sure. Maybe it would be beneficial for me to go very briefly back to the genesis of Alzheimer's, because it helps bring into context the answer to your question. So back in 1906, the disease was first described by its namesake, a German scientist, and he described the disease as a combination of two kinds of protein deposits in the brain, one called amyloid deposits. These are the sticky plaques that people may have heard of, and also tau proteins inside the nerve cells of the brain. And these are the so-called tangles for their kind of tangled string shape. And he noticed these in the brain tissue of a deceased patient of his, a woman who had terrible dementia pretty early in life, as a matter of fact. And he described the disease as the combination of these two types of proteins in the brain tissue plus dementia. That was Alzheimer's disease. But back in those days, rather few people, compared to today, lived to the old age that is characteristic of when the disease starts taking place in people. And consequently, it just was interesting to neuroscientists and neurologists, but it wasn't a big deal because not that many people were getting Alzheimer's disease. But over the course of the decades, of course, there had been numerous medical advances in heart disease and cancer and in diabetes, and there were vaccines and antibiotics. Suddenly, by the 50s, 60s, 70s, people were living a lot longer on the whole. And many, many people started to live way into old age. And many more people, of course, started to have the symptoms of dementia that are characteristic. And consequently, a lot more interest was going into Alzheimer's disease, and an enormous amount of funding began to go into the disease. Now, what we know is that the human brain is so complex. This is an enormously tough scientific and medical problem. So that accounts for part of why, unlike heart disease, unlike cancer, which are also, of course, very challenging medical problems, we have not seen the sorts of breakthroughs that have extended lifespans and even resulted in cures for some aspects of those diseases. And that's a big part of it. It's a tough problem. The other part, and this is something I go into in great detail in the book, is that there has been a degree of misconduct and a degree of mistaken thinking in the field, partly as a result of misconduct, that has deterred some advances and has slowed the exploration of possible remedies that might ultimately prove to be beneficial for the disease. So it's that combination of problems.
So that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is, what is the amyloid hypothesis?
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Andrew. It's a central question of my book is to examine the amyloid hypothesis and what it has meant in the disease. So back in the early 90s, a group of scientists began to think this amyloid set of amyloid proteins, the ones I mentioned before, the sticky plaques, and there's also other forms of amyloid proteins that become deposited in the brain, that these amyloid proteins really were central to Alzheimer's disease, that they caused a cascade of biochemical effects in the brain that eventually led to cell death and dementia of Alzheimer's disease. This is, in a nutshell, the amyloid hypothesis. And the reason why it gained so much street cred, if you will, among scientists and so much attention in the field and became the dominant way of viewing Alzheimer's disease is that it made a lot of sense, especially based on the definition of Alzheimer's by its original discoverer, if you will, Alois Alzheimer, the German scientist. And because of the sense it made that it was present in the brains of people who died with Alzheimer's disease, that it seemed to be associated with these symptoms, of course, there was a lot of logic to making a big concentration on that. So what happened was in the 90s and early 2000s, there were a lot of efforts made in drug development to essentially flush those amyloid proteins out of the brain as a remedy and as a way of either arresting, hopefully even reversing the symptoms of the disease, or at the very least, dramatically slowing down the progression of dementia. And what they found was that these drugs that were developed for flushing amyloids out of the brain were very, very effective at that task, but they were very ineffective at providing cognitive benefits for patients. Patients still had decline of cognitive abilities. There was no arresting of symptoms. There was no curing of the disease. And these remedies, many of them had very dangerous side effects, sometimes even at the risk of death. And so there was quite a bit of concern by the mid-2000s that maybe the amyloid hypothesis had been, although interesting and logical, and maybe even having some merit in exploring and understanding the disease, that perhaps it wasn't the linchpin that had been regarded as by so many scientists.
How did not just the widespread belief in the amyloid hypothesis emerge over time, but almost a bit of tribalism around it? Like, you refer to some of the leading proponents of it as the amyloid mafia. So how did that tribalism come about?
Sure. Well, you know that in science, there is enormous competition for mind share, for funding, for dominance in a set of ideas. And both because of the logic and the importance of understanding the role of amyloid proteins and related issues in Alzheimer's disease, and because of genetic information that was discovered over the years that suggested that genetic predisposition for the production of some of these proteins may be also associated with Alzheimer's disease, it made perfect sense for it to gain some dominance in the field. And so when you have this combination of scientific logic and you have people's entire careers based on proving out this hypothesis, and you have people's funding and enormous riches associated with consultation agreements with the drug developers who are involved in building drugs that are associated with the amyloid hypothesis, there are enormous incentives to create the conditions where this continued to be the primary, dominant, and sometimes in some circumstances, a way of looking at the disease that tended to crowd out other ideas, that tended to push alternatives to the sidelines. Not that they're completely eliminated. Science is vast, and these alternative ideas always had some of a following. But what we've seen over the years is that if it's hard to get funding for them, if it's hard to get scientific mindshare because of the predilection of scientific journals and the august experts in the field and the institutions that fund and oversee science, if it's hard to get their buy-in to robust exploration of other ideas, then this primary hypothesis tends to dominate. And this is what happened in Alzheimer's disease as well.
Okay, so to what degree, and you mentioned this earlier, did scientific misconduct around image doctoring in particular play a role in sort of building consensus around the amyloid hypothesis?
Yeah, so this is really where my investigative reporting started to enter the picture. And this was, in a sense, the genesis of my book, Doctored. So in early 2022, really at the very beginning of my discussions with Matthew Schrag, the scientist from Vanderbilt University, he had, in a sense, kind of in the process of improving his own skills in forensic image analysis, he had run across a study that had taken place at the University of Minnesota in 2006, and it was published in the journal Nature. And like the journal that I work for, Science, Nature is one of the preeminent scientific scholarly journals. And when you have an article in Nature, this is regarded as an important accomplishment, usually by scientists, and one that could have great influence. And so this study was pretty interesting. It was a clever study that took place at this moment of discouragement for the amyloid hypothesis, this moment when drugs had been tried and failed over and over, and people began to say, maybe we're barking up the wrong tree here. And the scientists at the University of Minnesota did something clever. They used genetically altered mice that produced copious volumes of amyloid proteins in their brains. They extracted a very specific type of amyloid protein because they come along a range. And this particular one they extracted was called amyloid beta star 56, if you will, their star protein, kind of what passes for a catchy name in science. Mm-hmm. And they took this star protein and they injected it into rats, and the rats began to show symptoms of memory loss that the scientists compared to the memory loss of Alzheimer's disease in people. And so what you had, in a sense, is the first cause and effect relationship between a specific amyloid protein and the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, albeit in animals, but still something that really captured the imagination of the scientific world. This article in Nature very rapidly became one of the most cited in the scientific literature, one of the most important advances in understanding Alzheimer's disease from a basic research standpoint in many years, and became something that formed a new head of steam behind the amyloid hypothesis, a new head of steam behind the idea that this hypothesis truly was the explanation for Alzheimer's disease, and that maybe they hadn't found the right remedies yet, but now they knew they were on the right path. So now just back up to my conversations with Dr. Schrag at Vanderbilt University, who, by the way, I should mention, he's a professor at Vanderbilt, but he was doing this scientific integrity image authentication work on his own time, not part of his work for the university. And what he found was that after he had stumbled across this study by the University of Minnesota scientists, is that several of the key images within this paper had apparently been doctored. In other words, the strong evidence that seemed to be a linchpin for reinvigorating, I should say, the amyloid hypothesis was very suspect, if not in itself the result of rank scientific misconduct. Obviously, this was a pretty stunning moment for him. And I remember this first conversation that he and I had about this at the time, when we both were reflecting on the fact that this very important experiment had apparently been doctored and what the implications might be for the field in raising questions for everyone about the validity of thinking that had followed that experiment. Because at that point in 2022, we were still on the same path, and we had seen drug failure after drug failure after drug failure associated with the amyloid hypothesis just continuing. So that was kind of a seminal moment. And I wrote a story about this in Science. And of course, just for listeners to understand that I go through an extremely rigorous process of validating the claims made, not just validating Schrag's motive bona fides as a scientist and as a scholar, but also making sure that his examination of these images was something that was shared by not just other forensic image experts, but also by leading scholars in Alzheimer's disease, so that when the story that I wrote finally about this came out, it was rock solid and basically indisputed by anyone in the field that we had a serious problem with this study, and the implications were big for it. Andrew, I wonder if it would be beneficial for me to briefly describe the images so that people have a visual idea of what's being manipulated. So in Alzheimer's disease, there are really two primary kinds of images that I'm talking about. One is something called micrographs of brain tissue. And these are highly magnified images of brain tissue. And what people do who are improperly changing these images is to sometimes clone sections of them using digital tools and programs like Photoshop, and maybe move things around within the image or duplicate certain elements of an image in other portions of the image in order to accentuate the idea of a strong response to a drug or a strong condition within the brain that might be very weak, but if you change the image in that way, you can make it appear to be strong. You can also erase certain things within a micrograph that had previously suggested a contradiction to a scientific idea, that maybe you just make it go away. And so then what you have is a situation where the image seems to accentuate the thinking of a particular scientist. There's also another kind of image called a Western blot. And these are a way of showing the amount and types of proteins within a sample. Now, this is very important within a tissue or blood sample. It's very important within Alzheimer's disease because, as I mentioned earlier, it's really a disease where proteins play an important role. The so-called amyloid proteins and the tau proteins being examples of that. And when they're measuring these proteins, where they find them, what kinds of proteins, what their molecular weight is, and the amounts of them can have a big bearing on conclusions about what role they might play in the disease and how important they might be. And so if you take one of these Western blots, which look like a series of stacked bands, kind of irregularly shaped stacked bands, what you can do is lighten a band or darken it to change how it might show the amount of a particular protein in a sample. Or you can move one or erase it or duplicate a band in certain places in order to suggest that a certain effect happened in a certain set of testing of mice or of people. And all of these ways of changing the image, again, using a program like Photoshop, can radically change the conclusions of an experiment. Now, obviously, doing this is highly improper. It's a form of scientific misconduct. And because in this case of the experiment I mentioned, the 2006 paper in Nature, was subject to these kinds of changes, it was ultimately retracted by the journal, and it caused a lot of ramifications within the field in people's thinking about the disease.
Right. And so it can be a little bit of a slippery slope, right? Because there might be a purely good reason to use Photoshop, right? Scientists might want to highlight a certain part of the image so they can draw someone's attention to that specific part of it. Is that right? So it can be a little bit of a slippery slope where someone feels like they need to use Photoshop to begin with.
It's a good point and question, Andrew, in part because so many people, including myself, wonder what causes scientists who almost certainly start out with very good intentions, who are deeply committed to this process of exploration, to falsify images. And before I answer the question directly, which I will do, I just want to say that in my opinion, and I think the research validates this, it's only a tiny percentage of scientists who are actually doing this kind of image doctoring, engaging in this kind of misconduct. And it's like any other walk of life. I'd say that the vast majority of plumbers are honest and do good jobs. And because one is crooked and charges you too much or changes your pipes improperly, it doesn't mean you're going to stop using plumbers or think that all plumbers are corrupt. It's the same with scientists. But I think the important thing to remember is that when certain research is doctored, it can skew thinking in the field if it's a particular kind of research or if it has an important impact in people's thinking. And it can cause money to be spent in ways that are perhaps not the best, most advantageous ways for finding solutions to a disease. So I just want to make it clear that this is very important, but most scientists are honest, in my view, and are deeply committed to doing the right thing. Now, to answer your question directly, if I may, what I think often happens is that people who are involved in these experiments are under a lot of pressure. They're under a lot of pressure to show that their work is successful so that they can secure more funding to keep their lab lights on. They need these publications to advance in their careers. They need these publications sometimes even for a very successful scientist to further their careers, to further their influence. And it may start out as a simple thing of like just what might be called beautification of an image, to kind of just at the edges, make it look a little bit better, remove what might be regarded as quote unquote artifacts in an image that don't directly affect an experiment, to kind of improve the curb appeal, if you will, of an image within a paper. Because let's face it, journal editors who review these papers, they want not just truth, but beauty, and beautiful images in a scientific sense can improve the chances of having these images accepted for publication. Then I think what might happen is someone might feel deeply that their results are important, and they get a very weak result. Maybe there's a little indication in the scientific images that there might be some proof in the hypothesis that the scientist is trying to explore. But they think, well, I'm just going to accentuate that a little bit. It's not changing the whole idea. It's just showing that I've got something there. And I think in my next experiment, the results will be stronger. And so they do this. And this is not proper scientific technique. This would be seen as improper by almost everyone. But they often get away with it because the scrutiny of these images, the ability and the willingness of journals to be careful about this, and I'd say a lot of complacency takes place that makes it problematic. Now, then I think, as you say, the slippery slope takes place. They get away with this. Suddenly they think, my ideas are important, and also my career's advancement is important for me to continue to explore these matters. I think at this point, maybe some scientists cynically just completely change an image whole cloth to make it fit their experimental premise. And again, unfortunately, so often have had success in doing that. It's tragic, but it's unfortunately because of the complacency of the gatekeepers of scientific information. Historically, it's been a technique that's been unfortunately very, very common.
A big focus of the book are the image authenticators who essentially volunteer themselves to review image-based results and assess whether there's possible misconduct behind them. Can you describe this world, this community a bit? Like, who are these folks?
Sure. They often refer to themselves as image sleuths. Mm-hmm. And to me, this is a bit of a hopeful part of the process. And even though I work for an eminent scholarly journal myself, and I have enormous respect for the review process of scientific journals, there are a lot of flaws with it that have resulted in this kind of set of problems that I've been describing. And these image sleuths, if you will, are an important part of the way in which science is changing. So let me just say that I am someone who believes deeply in the idea that science is self-correcting. So as one of the key figures in the book, Matthew Schrag, has said, you can cheat to get a paper published, you can cheat to get some career advancement, but you can't cheat to cure a disease. Biology doesn't care. So that is totally true in science. It's true in biology. It's true in Alzheimer's disease. But the process of self-correction can often take years or even decades.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, a lot of time, a lot of thought in the field can be wasted. This is precious time that we need desperately to speed a cure for this kind of disease. And consequently, it's a terrible tragedy that these things can take so long. What we have here is a situation where crowdsourcing, in effect, has begun to fill the role for complacency at scientific journals that has been much improving over the years, but is still a problem within the scientific literature. And what these science sleuths do is that they, on their own time and of their own volition, for no pay, in 99.9% of the time, they are examining images because they're interested in helping improve the scientific record and posting comments about them, mostly to a site called PubPeer, which has thousands upon thousands of examples of possibly doctored or otherwise mistaken images within scientific experiments. And this does two things. It helps alert the journals that they need to re-examine these papers. And second, it puts scientists on notice that other people have eyes on this and that they need to be careful. They need to do a better job to possibly correct mistakes. And they also need to know that if they are engaging in improper activities, that there are eyes on that, and that sometimes this results more and more in retractions of papers or in merely examinations of these kinds of problems that have actually resulted sometimes in examinations of misconduct that have had big ramifications for people's careers as well.
What was it like for you to uncover all this? Was it jarring at all? I know you've been in the world of science for a long time. Maybe not even the degree of misconduct, but just some of the examples of it. I mean, there was someone who had risen up to a pretty high place in the US government. There was a mentor of a key person in the book. And then obviously what you talked about, where there was some image doctoring done to help support sort of a leading hypothesis in the world of Alzheimer's, where billions of dollars of funding flows through that. So what was it like for you personally to uncover all this?
Yeah, I have to say that it was pretty staggering to understand the importance of this in the process of exploring a cure for what is one of the most feared diseases in the world, and one that affects millions and millions of people. I have to say that I have to remind myself that, again, most scientists are honest, and even those who adhere to ideas in the field that are disputed, including the dominant hypothesis, the amyloid hypothesis, that these are people who are deeply committed to finding solutions. And I respect that they are committed to their beliefs for reasoning that is based on their own scientific judgment and experience. And I'm not challenging that. What I am challenging is the understanding of the field that may be based partly on a kind of groupthink that can attach itself to dominant ideas, combined with questions about the validity of science that may have been the result of improper or even fraudulent activities. I want to say, Andrew, if I may, this is a particularly awkward time in a way for science. Obviously, with the new administration in Washington slashing and burning critical elements of the scientific infrastructure at the National Institutes of Health, at the Food and Drug Administration, the CDC. I just want to make it clear that my book is extremely critical of I would say, the four key elements of the scientific authorities, the authorities that uphold and advance science in our country, the main funder, NIH, the regulator, FDA, for drug development and discovery, and the universities that are among the critical gatekeepers of knowledge, along with the scientific journals. All four are criticized heavily in my book for what I would call complacency, lapses. You alluded to one of the key scientists in Alzheimer's disease in the world, who was one of the top leaders at NIH. One of my investigations that is detailed in the book found that he was someone who apparently doctored his work for decades and had enormous influence in the field, and yet was given one of the top posts in leading and guiding this research globally. So it's very discouraging when you see situations like that. So I think everyone, all of us, has the right and responsibility to say these institutions should up their game. They should do better for the sake of patients and taxpayers and all of us. Now, that said, I just want to say that I completely oppose the approach being taken in Washington. I think RFK Jr. and others within the new administration who are slashing and burning these agencies are extremely wrong-headed in this. And look, I speak advisedly. RFK Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya, who is the new NIH director, have both referred to my work in their confirmation hearings. My work associated with concerns about Alzheimer's disease. They are correct and they are thoughtful in saying we need to address the problems in the field. Where I disagree with the approaches being taken is that we need to reinforce and reinvigorate and ensure that leadership in these agencies is excellent and that funding is adequate and that the approach they're taking is based on sound science. We cannot get there by slashing the institutional memory, by reducing the program so dramatically that we see a dramatically deleterious effect in the advancement of science globally. These programs are central to understanding of this disease and others, and I regret that these kinds of actions are happening right now.
You do say multiple times throughout the book, there's definitely just sort of a thread of this, that the vast, vast majority of scientists in government agencies and in universities are doing good, honest work every day. And the examples you sort of explore in the book, are just slim exceptions to the work that's being done every day. So you mentioned this earlier, that there's still a group of folks that are very big believers in the amyloid hypothesis. To what degree are they concerned that these examples of misconduct are going to sort of taint the theory behind it? In the sense that, because I think one thing in reading the book, you sort of have to separate the misconduct from the groupthink. Although they are connected a little bit, there's still a large group of people that are big believers in the amyloid hypothesis. There's still a lot of dollars flowing to it. How did that group of people respond to these instances of misconduct?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the response has been mixed. So just to give you an example, when my initial article about this topic came out in 2022, this was related to the 2006 paper in Nature that was eventually retracted. And what people said broke down along two lines, scientists, I should say, who were deeply involved in these kinds of experiments and work. One set said, this is an opportunity for a wake-up call for the field to allow us to re-examine our assumptions and to think more broadly, because we need to think more broadly because we have not found any remedy for Alzheimer's disease that arrests or reverses symptoms, and we desperately need that for our patients. The second group pretty much said, we knew all along that this experiment was not reliable and it has no effect whatsoever on our thinking. And I would just say, ironically, for the second group, those are the very same scientists who cited this experiment over and over and over, some up to a couple dozen times in their own scholarly writings as support for their own ideas about the amyloid hypothesis. So to me, it seemed a bit hypocritical. Now, I'd like to fast forward a little bit to the response to the book itself, and I know that you're interested in that. There have been enormous outpouring of interest in this book, and the vast, vast majority of it has been supportive and positive, not so much because people are saying everything about the amyloid hypothesis is wrong and we completely should switch gears. I think even the strongest critics of the amyloid hypothesis say that it's apparent that amyloid proteins have something to do with Alzheimer's disease, but perhaps not everything to do with it. So what I've heard from scientific and mainstream press, from doctors, patients, from loved ones all over the world who have responded to this book is thank you for bringing this forward. Now, there have been some very forceful critics as well. And what we've seen is that the critics are saying that the amyloid hypothesis is not just the best hope for curing the disease, but the only really strategically placed and beneficial way of thinking about it at this point. And they are saying that the book unfairly taints the field by pointing to a few instances of misconduct. Now, look, I would say that people need to take this criticism seriously, but also with some grains of salt, and I'll tell you what those are. One is the vast majority of critics are people whose entire careers have been based on proving out the amyloid hypothesis and having accepted enormous amounts of research funds and often personal fees from the makers of anti-amyloid drugs. So these are not people who are stupid people. They're very brilliant scientists, many of them. But people need to consider that when you have financial and professional conflicts of interest, that it can affect how you view concerns raised about that body of work. So that's number one. Number two is that there has been, I think, many people would say, a degree of complacency and arrogance in the field that, look, I don't want to blame the victim. The stuff going on in Washington, in my opinion, is wrong. It's based on wrong ideas about how to fix the problem. But there is a degree of complacency and arrogance in the scientific community that has led to concerns and skepticism among many people in the validity and the dominance of certain ideas, especially ideas in a field like Alzheimer's that have been really quite unsuccessful in arresting or reversing the symptoms of the disease. And so people are expressing frustration, and also they are legitimately asking, are there other paths we could travel because of the lack of success of this path, despite billions and billions of dollars of funding? So I would just say, I offer respect to the people who are critics of the book for their contributions to understanding Alzheimer's disease. But I would ask them to re-examine their own assumptions at times and to stop from mischaracterizing the book as saying one thing and when it's really saying something else. You know how it is with critics whose core beliefs are sometimes questioned by investigative reporting. They mount what I would call a straw man argument, where they mischaracterize the book and then attack their own mischaracterization. This to me is not intellectually honest. And even though I have respect for some of those folks, I would just say people should take their concerns with a grain of salt and read the book. Judge for yourself what I'm really saying.
Last question. Just mentioned this. What are some of the most promising ideas for the treatment of Alzheimer's that are outside of the amyloid hypothesis?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Andrew, because I really like to be able to say that there is a lot of hope going on in research for this disease, not even excluding the amyloid hypothesis, which, as I say, amyloid proteins have some role to play and they should continue to be studied. But some really interesting new developments involve, number one, GLP-1 inhibitors. These are the so-called miracle weight loss drugs like Wegovy and others that have been shown to have very promising effects, not just on weight loss, but on diseases like diabetes and others. And they are now being considered as a possible remedy for early stage Alzheimer's disease. They're being studied in large scale clinical trials. Even as early as next year, we may know whether these might have an important role today to play, perhaps by controlling inflammation in the brain, which is one factor that people think is important in Alzheimer's disease. Second, there's a lot of people who believe that latent infections, viral infections, could also be a factor in Alzheimer's, perhaps a causative factor that should get more attention than it has been getting up till now. And there are, again, clinical trials to treat these latent infections, one being herpes virus. So this is the virus that causes cold sores that then resolve over time, yet can hang out in the brain for years or even decades and might be causing, or at least involved in some of the terrible dementia effects of Alzheimer's disease. There are treatments going on right now within clinical trials that are exploring whether that might be a way of attacking Alzheimer's. So I'm looking forward to seeing the results of that. To me, those are two among a number of really interesting areas of research that could have a beneficial effect over time. The last thing I just want to leave people with is that people should remember that even though there is no brain game or supplement or dietary habit that is a cure for Alzheimer's, or in my view, really is a preventive for Alzheimer's, we should understand that we have agency in our lives, and that the risk factors for Alzheimer's, like high blood pressure, high cholesterol levels, poor dietary habits, sedentary lifestyles, these are all things that we have some control over and that we can influence in our lives. And that if we do, we can lessen the likelihood that we'll have a serious case of Alzheimer's earlier in life, that we can perhaps forestall the day when those symptoms become important, terrible experiences in our lives. And so I just encourage people to live your best lives. And in doing so, reap the benefits, not just generally, but also possibly as a way of forestalling or improving our chances of having a lesser case of Alzheimer's.
Charles Pillar, thank you so much for the work you did in writing this book. And it seemed like it was a lot of work. And thank you very much for coming on the podcast to talk about it.
Thanks so much, Andrew, for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Same here.